All right, so welcome back to Legally Everywhere, where we are what? We legally everywhere. We looking into everything. And if you're just tuning back in, I just walked you through the power and control wheel for Venezuela, right? So now we have to talk about how the impact is absorbed. Because remember, I told you this, the things that happen at a systems level or the systemic level, right? It trickles down to the individual. The individual absorbs the impact. And I want to explain how we absorb the impact, right? Whether it is the consumer of a corporation or constituent of a country or a nation, entity, a body, right? We absorb the impact. So I want to explain that. Let me show you this image I put together. Okay, so I know y'all see all of this. Okay, because boom, right? So let's talk about it. Impact absorption is what happens when decisions are made at the top of the system. But the cost of those decisions, they're put downward. So that's what I was saying. The things they do up here, it affects us down here. In theory, risk is supposed to be absorbed by the entities making the decisions. You know what I'm saying? But you got to think about it. Better yet, in practice, risk is transferred to consumers and constituents. And what do I mean by that, right? You got to think. If two entities are sitting together having a conversation, right? And they're having a contract, and they're set up a contract. You have to think, if I'm negotiating for my terms and I'm trying to strategize around benefits, costs, I'm trying to do risk mitigation and all that, right? I'm going to shift liabilities as much as possible. So I must make sure I don't have those liabilities. I'm going to make sure I'm not absorbing risk, right? I'm going to push it back to you, right? On the opposing side, right? You're also going to try to mitigate risk, impact, harm, damage, right? You're going to do risk reduction. So what you're going to also push, if you're both pushing from your ends, if it's sitting in the center, at this point, what you're going to start to push it down. So the two people who are in the meeting, they're pushing it in the middle. They both are meeting to address the consumers that they serve. So who is the consumer in that situation? Constituent, consumer, client, whatever the system, whatever the setup. Guess what? Who's absorbing it? You are. It's going what? It's going downward. So we see this right here. Government agencies, corporations, financial institutions, contractors, supply companies. You know what I'm saying? Guess what? Foop. It goes downward. So it's transferred to the consumer and the constituents. So this is where we're going to start to look into Venezuela, right? Because once again, I said before, this is one of the clearest models of like a modern example, right? So at the top of this model that I have right here, you have powerful actors, right? I just said it. State, financial institutions, multinational corporations, regulatory bodies. You know how I feel about them regulatory bodies. Okay, boom. These actors, right, they control access to currency, access to markets, access to trade, access to financial systems, right? They control all of that. So when sanctions roll their butt into the conversation, they have now entered the chat. When sanctions are imposed, when assets are they frozen, right? Your money. What dollar bill, y'all? When they freeze your assets, when trade routes are restricted, you can't move it. You can't spend it. These actors are pretty much they're insulated from the consequences of the system, of the structure. So we hit one? Boom. Now we're in the regulatory breakdown, right? You have all these little things that are happening. So when corporations and institutions don't absorb the hit, corporations are structured to avoid absorbing loss, right? So how do they do that? Like, how are they going to do that? They're going to do that by raising prices, right? They're going to make exit markets. They're going to shift supply chains. They're going to pass costs forward. What does that mean? It hits our pockets, right? They're all up in our pocketbooks. That's what happens. Financial institutions pretty much do the same exact thing. They all up in our pocketbook. They reconstruct debt, restrict access to get yourself out of said debt, right? And sometimes they just pull out entirely and be like, well, listen, you're going to figure it out. Okay? So the loss doesn't like disappear. It doesn't disappear. It moves. It moves. Right? So once again, back to the example, right? In Venezuela, the impact lands on the everyday person, right? Remember, if you watch back to my first videos, I'm talking about you're surrounded by wealth, right? You're surrounded by this asset, this oil, right? Oil is traded in what? U.S. currency, which makes the U.S. dollar more valuable. So I'm surrounded by this wealth. In theory, I should be able to benefit from said dollar. Right, that's U.S., currency. It's U.S. dollar, right? I should be able to benefit from this asset, from this wealth, right? But what it ended up looking like was inflation that destroyed purchasing power. It ended up looking like shortages of like basic goods. It looks like currency instability, because while all the things that happened to their economy as they were going back and forth with regard to this asset, this is over multiple decades, go back to previous videos if you don't feel familiar with what I'm saying. Think about, that's a currency instability. Like, it destabilized their economy. But think about this loss of access to international banking. Instability, like with regard to like an inability to import necessities, right? Things to make it more appropriate for you to get out the asset, right? To sell said thing, right? Or in general, just your regular, let's say, resources that you might use, that you need for sustainability in general, not just for the asset, but sustainability of the people themselves, right? Okay, so the individual consumer becomes the what? The shock absorber. Remember, we used to wear some shock supports in the school and the shoes and stuff that had a little spring in there? Okay, maybe not. But you get what I'm saying, right, with that analogy. So why is this a governance failure? Like, why is this a governance failure, right? Because I feel like this is the important part. We get into the bread and butter right here. It's an economic issue, right? So it's a governance issue. Because when governance systems fail, they limit like unilateral pressure. They enforce like fair trade rules, check powerful actors, protect civilians from economic warfare, right? The system defaults to like easier outcomes at the end of the day. When systems fail, what they gonna do? They're gonna shift a liability and they gonna make the public absorb the harm. Because what? I'm not gonna take that. I'm not gonna hold that. That's how they operate. And when you understand that, it starts to make things make a little bit more sense. Let's connect this back to contracts and rules, right? Just real brief. Most of what we're talking about here isn't abstract, it's contractual. It's real contractual, right? Sanctions, trade agreements, debt structures, currency controls. These are all legal arrangements. And when enforcement mechanisms favor what the powerful actors, when they favor those who have power and have privilege, breaches don't get corrected. Because remember in the previous video, I said, who gonna check them? Who gonna make them pay, right? If something happens, breaches don't get corrected. They get externalized. They get sent to me and you. They get sent to what? The constituent. They get sent to what? Or better get who? The consumer, the client. They get externalized and sent back to the public. So the individuals who are supposed to benefit from the system, the protection of the system, the structural mechanisms of the systems are actually harmed by it. Because they externalize all the harm, right? So when people ask what actually happened in Venezuela, right? This is the answer. This is the real answer, right? Power was exercised. Pressure was applied. Risk was shifted. Point blank and period. Power was exercised. Pressure was applied. Risk was shifted. And the population absorbed the impact. They absorbed the harm that was done by the system, right? This is why Venezuela isn't just a story about oil and currency. It's so much deeper than that, y'all. Like, it's a case study in how systems transfer harm downward. Okay? So hopefully you see it. For my visual people, as I point here, it makes sense. See you in the next video.